3 German Shepherd puppies dangled from the edge of a concrete bridge, their trembling paws just inches from the raging, flood-swollen river beneath. The wind screamed through the Willowa Gorge like a warning, and no one on the bridge dared to move. Some filmed, others prayed, but no one acted, until a man in a worn jacket and haunted eyes stepped out from the crowd, a name long buried on his tongue: Titan. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The river ran high that morning, swollen from a week of late spring melt and an early dam release upriver. The concrete span of Willoway Bridge, broad, gray, and well-maintained, cut across the foaming water like a blade beneath it. The Willowa River roared, its surface fractured by white current and glistening debris. The hum of the nearby dam pulsed like a heartbeat through the valley. At 6:07 a.m., Heather Mays, a 29-year-old dental assistant and recreational jogger, slowed her pace as she reached the midpoint of the bridge. She was petite, red-haired, with earbuds always tucked in and a Fitbit on her wrist, counting every step like ritual. She ran this route daily, never expecting the world to break open in front of her. She didn't scream, she froze. 3 small shapes dangled from the outer railing of the bridge. Puppies, German Shepherds, no more than 6 weeks old, suspended by taut green paracord ropes knotted tightly around their necks and midsections. They hung over the edge, swaying inches above the churning water. Their eyes were wide, limbs trembling. One was entirely still. Heather's phone hit the asphalt before she did. She fell to her knees, breath heaving, when she found her voice. It was thin and cracking. She called 911, then again, no one answered. She flagged down a passing pickup, the driver, stunned, parked sideways across the bridge to block traffic. Within 10 minutes, a small group of townsfolk had gathered, forming a circle of murmurs and helplessness. Some stood with phones held aloft. Others just stared. The center point of the bridge had no safe path down. The ledge was too low to climb over without harnesses, and the swift current below made the thought of falling unthinkable. No rescue units arrived. The local station was understaffed, and the nearest animal control was 40 miles away in Pendleton. Whispers turned into frustration, then panic. The puppy's time was running out. Someone muttered, "Call him, the army guy, the one up on Ashfield Ridge, about 5 miles northwest, nestled among Douglas fir and cedar thickets." Ethan Caldwell stood beneath the rusting tin awning of his father's tool shed. He was 42, ex-military, tall with a squared jaw and lean build hardened by war and years of rural solitude. His face bore the faded trace of a scar over his left temple, nearly lost beneath his graying stubble. Most people in Willowa only knew him as that recluse in the hills. Ethan had once trained K-9 units for special forces, disciplined, purpose-driven dogs bred to fight and protect. But that part of his life had ended with the death of Titan, his last K-9 partner, during a night raid in Syria. The guilt had been enough to make him sell his house, move to his late father's abandoned property, and disappear from almost everyone's memory. He hadn't touched a dog since that morning. He was mending a broken fence post when his landline rang, something that happened maybe once every 2 weeks. It was Sheriff Mason Ridge, a man of few words and a longtime acquaintance. "You might want to head down to the bridge," Mason said. "There's a situation. Puppies. It's bad." Ethan didn't ask for more. He dropped the hammer, grabbed his coat, and left, back in town, in a weathered blue house across from the elementary school. Gracie Palmer sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom. She was 10, pale and quiet. With long dark hair that her mother always tied in braids she later undid when no one was looking. Gracie hadn't spoken more than a sentence at a time since the flood that took her father, Frank Palmer. A fire lieutenant swept away while rescuing a stranded motorist near the canyon bend. Gracie hadn't gone back to school. Instead, she stayed home with her sketchbooks, spirals of graphite-filled pages covered in strange, recurring dreams. She didn't talk to her mother much, either, Marla Palmer. 39 was tired, a widow too young and a painter too unrecognized. Marla now worked nights stocking shelves at the gas station and spent her days in silence, listening for signs that her daughter was still somewhere inside herself. That morning, Gracie's drawing changed. Instead of abstract waves or silent forests, she drew a bridge, solid, gray, and wide. From its center dangled 3 little dogs, suspended by green threads, and below them stood a man with a scar on his face, arms stretched upward as if ready to catch what the world had dropped. Gracie didn't know why she was drawing it. The vision came like all the others, in color first, then shape, then pain. She didn't even know his name. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of Willowa Bridge, the wind tugging at the collar of his field jacket, eyes locked on the 3 small bodies swaying from the outer rail. The river below raged with white froth and the roar of water crashing against rocks. No one spoke. The crowd that had formed earlier had now backed away, forming a hesitant half-circle, watching the lone figure who looked as though he didn't belong among them, and maybe he didn't anymore. Ethan dropped to one knee. The concrete was slick beneath his boots, the result of light rain and the mist rising off the river. He unhooked the carabiner from his belt, clipped into the anchor line he'd just secured to the thick iron support column, and tested it with a practiced jerk. His fingers remembered even if his soul resisted. He hadn't worn a harness in years, not since Titan. Someone from the crowd stepped forward. Kyle Benton, the town's mailman, a wiry man in his mid-40s with prematurely silver hair and nervous energy. He held a coil of unused rope in his hand, but didn't know what to do with it. Need a second pair of hands, Ethan didn't look up. Just keep people back, I need space. Kyle nodded and stepped away. Ethan swung a leg over the edge of the parapet and lowered himself. Inch by inch, the harness creaking against his frame. The wind picked up again, rattling the cables that ran the length of the bridge. The first pup, black with a narrow face and 2 large paws, was nearest. Its legs kicked faintly, body trembling. It whimpered as Ethan approached, but its eyes were focused, alert, intelligent beyond its weeks of life. "Easy," Ethan whispered. Reaching for the knot with one gloved hand, the rope had been tied tightly, military knots, clean and firm. The kind you didn't learn by accident. He flicked his knife open, cut the cord in one clean stroke, and caught the puppy with his free arm. It sagged into him, letting out a tired, hoarse sound that might have been relief. The second puppy was heavier, sandy brown with a rounder build and drooping ears. It was already unconscious, its limbs slack. Ethan's stomach twisted. He moved fast, slicing the rope and pressing the pup against his chest with the other arm. He adjusted his harness, feeling the weight of 2 small lives pressing into his ribs. The third pup hung furthest from the others, smaller, nearly limp, white patch on her chest. Barely breathing, Ethan whispered again. This time, not to the dog, but to himself. "You're not dying here, not today." He secured all 3 to his harness, looped the spare line through his secondary clip, and began the slow ascent. The crowd had grown dead silent. Kyle held the primary rope taut as Ethan climbed, inching back up the side of the bridge with steady, efficient movement that belied the years that had passed since his last deployment. When he pulled himself over the edge, soaked in sweat and mist, the cheer was quiet but deeply felt. Sarah Jenkins, a tall, thin woman in her late 30s who ran the local library and had been the first to call the sheriff, stepped forward with her jacket extended. She'd always been introverted, often perceived as cold, but not unkind. Her husband had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and since then she had become a quiet guardian of everything soft and helpless in Willowa. "You need somewhere warm," she said softly, nodding to the puppies. Ethan ignored the offered jacket. "I've got it." He wrapped the dogs in the thick blanket he'd brought in his truck, nodded once to Kyle, then turned away from the gathering crowd. No one followed him, back at the edge of Ashfield Ridge. Ethan's truck rumbled up the gravel drive and stopped beside the weathered woodshed behind the farmhouse. He carried the blanket gently, his boots sloshing through puddles from last night's rain. The shed hadn't been used in years. It still smelled of cedar chips and motor oil, but it was dry, and that was enough. He laid the pups on a bed of old hay and sleeping bags, one by one, checking their limbs, their eyes, their breathing. The black one curled quickly against the blanket, his chest rising slow and steady. The brown one stirred and gave a muffled whine, the smallest one, with the white patch, lay motionless for a moment longer, then finally twitched. Ethan closed his eyes. They were alive, barely, but alive. He stepped outside, leaning against the doorframe, rainwater dripping from his jacket. His thoughts spun. Those knots hadn't been random. Someone tied those dogs with care, calculation. Someone wanted them gone. Across the ridge, through a thicket of tangled underbrush, Gracie Palmer crouched behind a cluster of blackberry vines, peeking through the gaps in Ethan's wooden fence. She had followed his truck after overhearing a conversation at the general store. Most people ignored her. Some said she was weird, others pitied her. No one stopped her from wandering. She was 10, with tangled hair and a solemn face that rarely changed. The death of her father had hollowed her out. Since then, she had filled notebooks with drawings no one understood. She didn't speak in class, barely ate. But something had brought her here, curiosity or instinct. Maybe both. Through the fence. She saw the shed. Then she saw him. The man from her dreams, the scar, the shoulders, the silence. She watched him disappear inside and re-emerge, holding something in his arms. A moment later, she saw them. 3 small dogs, limp and muddy, but unmistakably the same ones from her latest drawing. One of them, the black one, turned its head and looked directly at her, not past her, not through her, at her. Gracie's heart raced. She backed away slowly, slipping the sketchbook from her backpack and turning to a blank page. Her pencil moved before her mind caught up, tracing the shape of the shed, the man and the dog with the dark eyes. She didn't know what any of it meant, but it was the first time in months that she felt something. Not just sadness or fear, something like warmth. The air outside the woodshed was still, unnaturally so. Clouds hung thick over Willowa Ridge, casting long shadows across the faded boards of the Caldwell farmhouse. The chill that clung to Ethan's porch wasn't from the wind. It was something older. A heaviness. A hum in the bones that only certain men recognized. The kind who had buried too many friends in foreign dirt and returned to a country that didn't recognize what they had left behind. Ethan stood barefoot on the shed's worn threshold, watching the 3 pups with arms crossed. Morning light spilled through the narrow slats above them. The black one, already sharper. Faster. more aware than the others, was now strong enough to walk in small circles. The brown pup lay curled beside a water bowl, peaceful. The smallest one, the pale one with the snowy mark across her chest, trembled even in sleep. Ethan's jaw tensed. He hadn't meant to name them, but names came anyway. The black pup was Axel, after a scout dog from his second deployment, who could sniff out tripwires from 30 yards away. The brown one became Bruno, like the lumbering medic who once taught him how to dress wounds with a torn t-shirt and dirt. The third, the little girl, was Luna, because something in her still felt lunar. Distant, cold, and glowing in silence. He crouched beside her and gently ran a finger along her spine. She didn't flinch anymore. That was progress. But he needed answers. From an old tackle box in the house, he dug out a handheld chip reader he'd last used a decade ago. It still worked, barely. He ran the scanner along Bruno first. A beep, then Axel, beep again. Finally Luna. Slower, beep. As if the chip was older or deeper. He walked to his desk, booted up the second-hand laptop from town, and connected the device. What popped onto the screen wasn't what he expected. K9 Elite Tactical Breeding Registry, Batch 0099A Sire, Titan, KIA, Afghanistan. 2017 Dam, Delilah, active status, rejected, evaluation incomplete recommendation. Contain or destroy his breath froze in his chest. Titan. The name blinked back at him like a ghost from a sealed room. Titan had been more than a partner. He had dragged Ethan out of fire, covered him during the ambush that fractured half his face. They had eaten together, slept in foxholes, and seen death with the same eyes. And now, these pups were his blood. A low bark snapped him back to reality. Axel had moved to the shed door and stood rigid, ears raised, body angled toward the woods beyond the fence, not barking out of play or hunger. This was a warning. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing at first, then a rustle, too precise to be a squirrel, a silhouette among the trees. Someone was watching, not just passing by. Watching. He stepped onto the porch with his rifle cradled loosely in one arm, just enough to be seen. The figure disappeared behind the brush, across the pasture road, down by the old trailhead where wild mint grew thick. Gracie Palmer crouched behind a broken fence post, breath tight in her lungs. She hadn't seen the man in the woods. Her eyes were focused on something else, a letter, tucked inside her jacket pocket, written that morning, with the kind of nervous care only a child could give. It was addressed in uneven handwriting, to the man with the dogs. Inside, it read, "I saw them before, in my dream. They were falling, and you caught them. I think I drew them before they got hurt. Maybe that means something. My name is Gracie. I'm 10. I didn't tell my mom I was writing this. Please don't be mad." She stood up, brushed dirt from her jeans, and crossed the gravel road like a soldier walking toward a ceasefire. She reached Ethan's front gate, an old iron latch held by twine, and placed a letter in the mailbox. Then she ran. Ethan found it less than an hour later, after feeding Luna from a dropper filled with goat's milk and vitamins. The envelope was folded twice and smelled faintly of dried flowers. He opened it slowly, frowning at the unfamiliar handwriting. By the time he finished reading, his eyes weren't narrowed with suspicion, they were softer, confused, but not hardened. He didn't recognize the name, but he knew the signs, dreams that matched real events. A child seeing something before it happened. It wasn't the first time he'd heard of it. In Afghanistan, there was a village boy who had drawn the coordinates of a roadside bomb days before it was planted. They called him cursed. Ethan called him alive. He grabbed his coat. The Palmer's house sat near the schoolyard. Faded blue paint flaking in strips, one shutter permanently hanging sideways like a half-blinked eye. Marla Palmer, Gracie's mother, was in the front yard pulling weeds from the flower bed. She was 39, medium build, with tired hands and eyes that looked through people rather than at them. She hadn't had time for grief. Gracie's silence had demanded all of her. Ethan approached slowly, hand raised. "I think your daughter wrote me," he said. Marla stood, squinting. She did what he handed her the envelope. She read it, lips pressed tight. "Gracie. She's not. She doesn't usually talk to people, not even me, not really. She's welcome to visit the dogs," Ethan said. "If she wants." Marla didn't respond right away, then she nodded. Once, sharply, "We'll come by this afternoon." Later that day, Gracie and Marla walked up the drive as the clouds began to break. Marla kept her distance, arms crossed, wary but civil. Gracie hung behind her mother, hands buried in her coat sleeves. Ethan stepped aside from the shed entrance. "Go ahead," he said gently. Gracie entered like someone stepping into church. The pups stirred. Bruno yawned. Luna blinked slowly, but Axel stood up, walked directly to her, and sat, not wagging, not barking, just still. Eyes locked on hers. Gracie smiled, not wide, not loud, but for the first time in a year. She smiled. The air had turned brittle by the time Ethan noticed the black SUV. It rolled up the winding gravel road leading to his farmhouse just past noon. Silent. Deliberate. Its windows tinted to hide the faces inside. Ethan was sitting on the porch sharpening a folding knife. Luna curled up at his feet like a pale whisper. Bruno lay in the patch of sun near the barn, snoring softly. And Axel, as always, watched. Ethan stood, the knife slipping quietly into his pocket. He didn't call the dogs to him, he didn't have to. The SUV came to a stop. The engine ticked in the stillness. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, early 50s, tall, with a military bearing and salt and pepper hair cropped close to the scalp. He wore a black jacket with no insignia, no badge, and no expression. "I'm looking for Mr. Caldwell," he said, voice flat. "You found him?" Ethan replied. The man gestured to the back door of the SUV, and another figure emerged, a younger man, clean-shaven, thin, with narrow eyes and a clipboard in hand. He didn't make eye contact as he stepped forward. "We're representatives of the K-9 Elite Tactical Program," the first man said. "We're here to collect assets assigned to breeding batch 099A. You mean the 3 puppies someone tried to hang off a bridge?" Ethan's voice remained level. "That batch was deemed unstable," the younger man said, finally looking up. The breeder made an unauthorized release. "We've been tasked with retrieving the dogs for containment and disposal." "You mean killing them," Ethan corrected. The older man shrugged. "Correcting a liability." "No," Ethan said simply. There was a long pause. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly. They're not going anywhere." The older man tilted his head slightly. "You're not a civilian. I can tell by how you stand. You know how protocols work. I also know how people hide behind them when they're scared of truth," Ethan said. "Those dogs are alive because I got there first." "You didn't." The man's jaw twitched. "We'll be in touch." They left without further argument, but not without a final glance from the older man, one that lingered longer than necessary, as if memorizing the layout of the land. That night, the wind picked up across the ridge, brushing cold fingers against the window panes of the shed. Ethan sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee, shotgun resting beside him. Axel lay by the door, ears tilted forward, eyes open. He hadn't moved for nearly an hour. Bruno and Luna were asleep inside, bundled in wool blankets and the quiet rhythm of safety. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Axel growled. Ethan was on his feet before the sound finished leaving the dog's throat. Outside, the darkness was thick, but movement near the fence line disrupted it. Just a flicker, a flash of motion too quick to be natural. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun, stepping off the porch with silent, trained ease. Axel moved first. The dog leapt down the steps, paws striking the ground with purpose, body low and coiled like a spring. As Ethan rounded the edge of the barn, he caught the beam of his light against the figure of a man, clothed in dark tactical gear, crouched near the storage shed where the pups slept. "Hey!" Ethan's voice cracked the night. The man bolted, but Axel was already there, with stunning precision. Axel moved like a shadow, intercepting the intruder before he could clear the side gate. He lunged, not to bite, but to block. The man fell backwards, crashing into the fence post with a grunt. Ethan stepped in seconds later, shotgun aimed but fingers steady. The man scrambled to his feet and took off into the woods. Ethan didn't fire. He looked down at Axel, who stood perfectly still. Tail low, eyes bright. "You held a perimeter," Ethan whispered. "You weren't scared. You knew." He reached down and rested a hand on Axel's shoulder. "You're not just trained. You're born for this." The next morning, Ethan drove down to the Willowa Sheriff's Office. The old brick building still smelled like wet wood and floor polish. Inside, Sheriff Mason Ridge sat behind a desk too big for the room, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that said, "Don't make me deputize your grandma." Mason was 60, built like a fire hydrant, with a gruff face and a deep voice that had soothed panicked townspeople for 3 decades. He'd served with Ethan years ago. Same base, same heat, different wounds. Ethan dropped the chip reader, the documents, and the file onto the desk. "They came looking for them yesterday," he said, "and last night. Someone broke onto the property." Axel stopped him cold. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Axel, the black one, Titan's pup." Mason flipped through the printouts, his mouth tightening at the word dispose. "Well," he said, "this stinks worse than week-old catfish. You think you can dig into it, I'll make some calls," Mason said. "But these kinds of outfits, they've got money, lawyers, friends in quiet places. You sure you're ready for whatever comes next?" Ethan looked him dead in the eye. "They're not getting those dogs." Mason nodded once. "Then neither am I." While Ethan faced the past, Gracie Palmer continued to arrive at the farm every afternoon after school. She didn't knock anymore. She simply walked the trail she had memorized, carrying a small canvas bag with colored pencils, a notebook, and tiny homemade treats her mother helped bake. Her bond with Luna, the fragile white pup, had deepened into something gentle and constant. Gracie would sit in the hay beside Luna, brushing her with slow, careful strokes, humming tunelessly under her breath. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't, but the look in her eyes was no longer vacant. It flickered, glowed, found focus. Luna followed her now. Even when Ethan called for food, she trusted no one else to brush behind her ears. Once timid and cold, Luna now wagged her tail when Gracie entered the shed, and once, just once, she let out a soft bark that made Gracie laugh so suddenly she startled herself. That laugh echoed across the field and made Ethan turn his head from the porch. He didn't say anything, but something shifted in his chest. Healing. It had a sound. The first snow of early winter dusted the fields beyond Ethan Caldwell's porch, coating the tops of fence posts and the hay bales still waiting to be hauled in. It wasn't enough to stick. Not yet. But it was a reminder that time had moved on. The leaves were mostly gone now, leaving only bare branches and the whistle of dry wind sweeping through Willowa Ridge. Ethan stood with a thermos of coffee in hand, watching Axel weave through the homemade obstacle course with quiet, deliberate focus. The black German shepherd had grown leaner, faster, each movement sharp and efficient, like a soldier who didn't need orders anymore, nearby. Bruno lay stretched in the last slice of sun, and Luna sat in the tall grass beside Gracie Palmer, her pale coat catching the light like silk. It had been 6 weeks since the investigation had closed. 6 weeks since Sheriff Mason Ridge walked up to the porch with a folder in one hand and a grim expression on his face. They found enough to file, he'd said, official charges, animal cruelty, unlawful euthanasia orders, misappropriation of funds. The guy running that K9 program, Connor Slate, real name Charles Kessler. He's going away for a long time. Ethan hadn't answered right away. He'd only watched the 3 pups, still sleeping in their shed that morning, unaware they'd ever been scheduled for destruction. They tried to bury a mistake. Mason added, "You didn't let them." Later that same week, Ethan drove Bruno out to the Willowa Veterans Recovery Center. The van that met them in the gravel lot was driven by Clara Winston, a nurse in her 50s with short auburn hair streaked with gray and a pink cane covered in cartoon cat stickers. Clara had the calm, steady voice of someone who'd seen pain and learned how to hold it quietly. Bruno greeted her like they'd already met. He wagged his tail once, stepped forward, and leaned into her side. Clara stroked his back with a soft hum. "He'll be part of our low-sensory garden program," she said. "Just presence. He'll be someone to sit beside." Ethan nodded. That's who he is. Bruno didn't look back as the van pulled away. He was home already. Luna stayed with Gracie. The first weekend visit had turned into 2, then 3, eventually. Ethan packed a small canvas bag, Luna's worn blanket, a squeaky fox toy, and 2 tins of food, and handed it to Marla Palmer, Gracie's mother. Marla had softened in the past month, her voice warmer, her posture less guarded. The walls around her grief hadn't fallen, but they had cracked just enough for light to slip in. "She sleeps better with Luna next to her," Marla said. "She always did." Ethan replied, "Gracie," now speaking in full sentences again, waved as she walked away with Luna trotting proudly at her side, for the first time since her father's death. She had something of her own that didn't vanish. Axel stayed with Ethan. They became a team, working, walking, training. The routine wasn't strict, but it had structure, early mornings, obstacle runs, tracking drills in the forest. Ethan didn't issue commands like a handler. He spoke like a man to a partner. And Axel responded in kind, soon. Word got out, first. It was a local shelter that asked Ethan to speak about rehabilitation. Then the Willowa Elementary School invited him for Career Week. Axel sat beside him in the library, vest labeled Service Partner, watching the kids with alert, measured calm. Ethan told the story without notes, about the morning on the bridge, about how the world had given up on 3 lives because they didn't meet someone's criteria. How instinct and training had intersected at the exact moment a man, broken and alone, found 3 animals as lost as he was. He didn't say he was saved, but it was implied. The children listened quietly, some squirming, some hugging their knees, but none of them laughed or looked away, not even once. And then Gracie stood up. She was wearing her favorite blue sweater, the sleeves too long, her hair in a braid that had come slightly undone. Luna padded beside her, tail brushing gently against the wooden floor. Gracie stepped to the front of the room and held up a drawing. It was simple. A bridge, 3 dogs, and a hand reaching down from above. She didn't need a script. I used to feel like I was falling. She said, all the time, and I didn't think anyone would catch me. Her voice was quiet but steady. But these dogs, they didn't just survive, they saved. They gave me something to hold on to, and I think they reminded me that even when you're small, or scared, or broken, you're still worth keeping. The room went silent. Then one child began to clap, then another, until the whole library filled with the sound, not loud, but real. Ethan looked down at Axel, who didn't move, but somehow he was smiling too, sometimes. Miracles don't come in thunder or light. Sometimes they come in the shape of a trembling puppy tied to a bridge and the hands that choose to lift them. This story reminds us that what the world discards, God still calls worthy. When we choose compassion over convenience, when we rescue instead of turn away, we become part of something holy. Perhaps it was no accident that Ethan found those dogs. Perhaps God placed them there, not just to be saved, but to save others in return. Gracie's healing, Bruno's comfort, Axel's purpose, they weren't just coincidences. They were proof that redemption often arrives with 4 legs, soft eyes, and a second chance in your own life. Look for those quiet miracles, the ones right at your feet, or waiting behind the fences of your heart, and when they come, don't turn away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment, Amen, if you believe every life, no matter how broken, is still part of God's plan. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of faith, healing, and the incredible bond between animals and people. May God bless you and your loved ones with second chances, just like He did for Ethan, Gracie, and the 3 who were kept.